Danger, danger. You are listening to Thursday We Have Ways special, our second. I mean, to be honest, we could do a month of these, a month of Thursdays. We're talking to Professor Daniel Todman, author of Britain at War.
Britain's War. Britain's War.
Britain's War. Sorry, James.
Britain's War.
Britain's War. 1937 to 1947. Is there eventually going to be a great big fat single volume, Lord of the Rings style?
No, I think volume 2 tests the limits of what a book can do.
No, you're wrong. You're wrong. What tests the limits of what a book can do is Any by my friend Peter Caddick-Adams.
So there comes a point where they say we're going to have to print this on thinner paper and use a special small font,
microfiche,
and all those sorts of things. So,
and it comes with it comes with a magnifying glass.
Yeah, if they put them together, I mean, a cased edition would be nice.
Yeah, you like the idea of that. You'd like to see that in your study, wouldn't you? Yeah. Last Thursday, in passing, I brought up the British manipulating the tungsten price in Spain, which is the thing in the second volume that really caught my eye, because it was in amidst all the other kind of warfare that Britain was practicing, but economic warfare. Just take us through that, Dan, because it's fascinating, because people don't know about this.
So Britain's strategy in the war is always based around two principles, really. One is that it can wield economic power, and that you can use economic power to make things very difficult for your opponent, and that ultimately breaking down your opponent's economy might be a way to win the war. And the other is that morale and economy are interlinked. So the obvious route to that is workers' morale means that they might not produce as much, or if they're not being fed enough in particular, that their morale will go down. So these are both lessons that the British had drawn out of what they thought had happened in the First World War, where there's a strong presumption that the blockade had a decisive effect on Germany. It's what leads to German breakdown in 1918. So start the Second World War, Britain puts into place plans to do the same thing. Operating the blockade gets much harder after May 1940, because suddenly Germany is dominant in Europe in a way that it hadn't been before.
Yes, it's got coastlines.
It's got coastlines. Britain itself might be subject to a form of blockade via submarines and aircraft. And yet Britain will continue to try to cut off Germany's access to the international resources that it needs to fight the war. And you can see that in various different ways, but one that you see operating from 1940 onwards is trying to manipulate the price of tungsten. So, key rare metal required particularly for the core of anti-tank shells, things like that, which a large amount of which is produced in Spain and in Portugal. And the way that the British do that is just basically to try and buy up the whole of Iberian production. And what's interesting about that is that preemptive purchase, which is a tactic they use elsewhere, has the economic effect that you might predict, which is not, in fact, to buy up the whole of the supply that there is, but to dramatically increase the supply, because there's a very strong incentive for those governments to mine more tungsten, because they're getting such a colossal price for it.
So the Germans end up paying more for the tungsten, don't they? Because the going rate for tungsten goes up.
So
it is damaging the German economy one way or another.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite hard to damage the Nazi war economy, because in the end,
it's all bogus anyway.
It's all bogus anyway. They're just willing to print some more money if they have to, or steal some more from somebody else to pay for it. But
Greece, for example.
It's that process of making things harder that I think is interesting.
Yeah.
And also why you've got to think about Britain still being quite a strong country, even in 1940 when it looks like it's in a weak position, because it's able to exercise this long-term effect on the German war economy.
Yeah.
Right. So even if I think you don't see the United States actually come into the war, so if there's no Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and there's never an incident in the Atlantic that forces the US into the conflict, I still think you see the British Empire and the Soviet Union after June 41 eventuly defeat.
One way or another.
Yeah,
but probably with the Red Army in Paris. So,
or an internal coup in Germany to give up quicker. Yeah, which is what the British presumed would happen.
Right, because right from the start, the British are thinking at some point this is going to fall in on itself. The Nazi government will fall in at some point, and that's the ongoing attitude throughout the war. And there's always attempts to kick the door down and make the thing fall in on itself. That's the attitude, and you basically tighten the pressure on the German economy and therefore government and population, blah blah blah. And you do that with area bombing. You do that with like you say, blockade. You do that by propping up Germany's enemies as well, because it's the other thing. It's getting stuff to the Soviets. All that's all part of the same picture, isn't it?
Well, and it's a very reasonable presumption. Yeah. You look back to the autumn of 1918. What happens? It becomes obvious that the war's unwinnable for Germany, and it leads to a crisis in German command and a crisis on the German home front.
Yeah.
So one of the things I think is interesting about that second conflict, and one of the reasons that I think historians of Britain's war need to think more about the chronology of the global conflict, is the fact that the Second World War doesn't end in September 1943
when it ought to.
Yes, well, if you look back to
reasonably, yeah. But you're not dealing with rational actors in Germany at all, are you? Really? You put the face when I said that.
I think there's a strong degree of rationality, but the rationality is driven by an ideology which is about destruction. Yes. So if the people at the top believe that if you're going to win the war, if you're going to lose the war, rather, that you deserve to go down in flames.
I mean, but that's very much the Hitlerian view, isn't it? It's a kind of, it's the 1,000-year Reich or it's Armageddon, and there's absolutely no grey area at all.
Yes,
but just to go back to kind of resources and stockpiling and stuff. I mean, one of the characters that I know you've written about and who I became very interested in was Oliver Littleton, who then becomes Lord Chandos, and he's an extraordinary guy because he's got a very good First World War record. I think he's got an MC and mentioned in dispatches several times. He's been very brave. He's very well connected, and he's obviously one of those guys who's an incredibly smooth operator. He's a well connected, clever businessman, and he's got all sorts of steel enterprises, including he's CEO of a German company that's been merged into, this is if I remember rightly, of some British company. And he sees the writing on the wall in the late 1930s and starts doing deals in Australia and the Far East and all sorts of stuff to buy up all sorts of supplies and making sure. And so he says, okay, I'm going to guarantee you a British government price for this material for the next 3 years, as long as you only sell it to us and no one else. And I'll pay above the odds to make sure that you get it. So this is an extension of the tungsten thing.
What's interesting about Littleton is you call him a businessman, but he's not really a businessman of the sort that made up a lot of the Conservative Party in the 1930s, who were managers, people who had big factories and things like that. He's a financier. I mean, those more traditional Tories call him a city shark, because he's the guy who can see the price of resources, who can co-opt the loan from somewhere else to get the money to, who can put the whole package together. So I think he's absolutely a smooth operator and somebody who gets things done, which is the reason Churchill brings him in.
He's an imperial global capitalist.
Yep,
exactly that. But he's exactly what you need, and it's interesting because he wrote a memoir which is very interesting. There's some fabulous insights on Churchill in the course of this book. But that prompted me to then kind of dig a little bit deeper, and his papers are up at Churchill College. So you can look at that, and then of course his footprint, because he later becomes Minister of Supply, is on just zillions of things, and you realise that actually he's one of the really key players to Britain's war effort from the start of the war to the very end. And yet he's someone who is just totally forgotten now. I mean, no one's ever heard of him. It's absolutely extraordinary.
Well, but that's what that whole swathe of people I think would have wanted. Right?
I'm sure.
Littleton, Sir John Anderson.
Yes.
These are these major figures who allow the war effort to function, who are very
behind the scenes,
high-functioning technocrats.
Yep.
People who are brought into government but aren't really. I mean, those are. Both Anderson and Littleton are conservatives, but they're quite pragmatic conservatives. And would they have wanted to be remembered? I mean, lots of this stuff is deliberately meant to happen behind closed doors.
Sure, but it's just fascinating, though, isn't it? But they are still key players, and as much as a kind of leading air marshal or a leading general is, they're the part they play in steering the Allies and Britain specifically towards a kind of eventual victory is every bit as important. And yet, because we have this incredibly tunnel vision view of the Second World War, which is strategic level, tactical level, they rarely come into it. And I think, one of the reasons why I think what you're doing is so important is that it is opening people's minds to this kind of, war is a bigger operation than just sort of landing on a beach and firing from your Sherman.
Well, which leads me on to another thing that really struck me from both volumes is Parliament. We don't talk about Parliament in the Second World War very much at all. We talk about there's a national government, Tories working hand in glove with Attlee, Morrison and so on. But actually there's all sorts going on. I was telling a friend when I just finished reading the second volume, a political journalist I know, and I was telling him about it. And he said, "Oh, well, they were at it, weren't they? They were at it. It was business as usual in Parliament, even though you've got a war effort, national government. Supposedly everyone singing for the intriguing, the politicking. It all carries on, doesn't it?
Well, it does, but in a new. I mean, you got to have
a new context.
Yeah,
but they're still at it. They're politicians, so they are. You and you've got Churchill containing Cripps, because Cripps obviously comes through as kind of number 3 or 4 as a possible future Prime Minister contender. So Churchill, knowing Stafford Cripps well, makes sure he's got jobs that he will hurl himself into and occupy himself with and be distracted by. So he sends him to Moscow, does all these sort of things because he's got to. Politics is still going on, and people need to be contained, and people need to be, and so on.
So you've got two different things going on. I mean, so Parliament remains important for the first year or so of the war. Right? So that's where you'll see the key bit of party political jiu-jitsu of the conflict, which is Labour using the fact that trade unions have got to be involved in mobilising the country for total war to get Neville Chamberlain out. And that the fact that will happen, providing they don't totally screw up the timing, is quite apparent from September 1939. The risk is if the crisis in the West comes too early and Labour leaves that moment too late, they go too early, they end up looking unpatriotic. Yeah. So there's a real piece of political skill there, and a set of traps that Chamberlain falls into, and he's not the skilled political operator that somebody like David Lloyd George would have managed to jump out of that trap.
He'd have pulled the rabbit from the hat at the right moment. Yeah.
Once you've got that national government formed, then Parliament becomes less important. And one of the things I think is interesting, of course, MPs keep intriguing, but actually by 1942, almost everybody who's really worth their salt is either away from Westminster doing something for the war effort. Probably they're in the forces if they're a Conservative, or they're doing something to organise factories if they're Labour, or they've been brought into government. So you've got this kind of residuum of MPs, lots of whom are Conservatives who were left over from big majority governments in the 1930s, and big majority governments end up having all sorts of people elected who nobody thought would be elected, who might not be terribly good at being MPs. That's the sort of person who's left in Westminster by 1942. And of course they keep intriguing, but very, very ineffectively. Yeah. And that's why Churchill's position is really safe. So there's a lot of discussion in the historiography about what's happening in Parliament in 1942, for example. Churchill's pretty safe from Parliament because there isn't somebody else who's going to rise up, who's not already in the government. Yeah. Actually, then what you're seeing from 42 through to 45 is the different big figures in the government manoeuvring against each other. Yeah. And lots of them are looking to what's going to happen afterwards.
Yes, because that really becomes that's the debate at the high level in politics, isn't it? And Churchill really wanting to stall for quite a long time about what to do about rebuilding the country, what actually to cede to Labour, what actually you do next. And the Beveridge report, of course, comes in, and he eventually gives in to commissioning that. He has to deal with the knock-on effects of that and its publication, it being a bestseller, all that sort of thing. And that's where the political action is, isn't it?
Well, that's right. And also thinking about what will the post-war look like. So I think, again, they're looking back to the model of the First World War. So there's quite a strong presumption right the way through that if you have a post-war election, that the victors of that will be some kind of coalition under a Churchill stamp. Yeah. Just as the David Lloyd George coupon had won the 1918 election. Yeah. So it's reasonable to think, well, the Conservatives have effectively won every election since 1931. Some kind of variety of Conservative coalition is going to be what wins in the future. Conservative political machine is incredibly effective in the 1930s, and Labour's isn't. So that what actually happens in 1945 is very unexpected. But because they're working on that presumption that the post-war might see another coalition, that's then the space within which people like Eden, like Morrison, like Bevin are all operating to think about how they can get what they want. And there might be quite a good reason. If you don't think that you're going to be in a majority government post-war, then get embedded every bit of social change that you can before the conflict finishes. Commit that future government to doing something. Try and make sure that you will have a place in that post-war transitional period where you'll be able to get some more of what you want into place. So it could be, and also, the other thing is nobody wants to give up power. No, all those ministers, they've by the time you get to 44, 45, they're very experienced at using power. They know how the levers work. The ministerial dross, a lot of that's been got rid of. So there's a pleasure to being good at your job.
And Labour have also made a case for planned economy stuff as well, haven't they? They've been able to demonstrate its effectiveness through the war, haven't they? Which then leads you to what happens in the Attlee government. But they can make a case. They can say, look, it works. What we've been doing works.
Although
they've not been able to do before. They've simply not been able to do before. Labour really haven't had a proper go at government, full stop, until the war, have they?
No, I've said so. Again, there's two different things there. One is demonstrating that they can be responsibly patriotic. That Labour and government won't just turn the whole ship over and try and launch a revolution. And the other is showing that bits of a Labour policy agenda might work. So those are things like the government taking more control of industries in crisis. Saying that planning's a big mantra for that post-war government, but it's very hard. What they discover is planning
difficult.
The whole economy is really hard, even during in the
and
middle
also
of the
they've
conflict,
got to,
the whole economy.
Post-war, you've got to kind of bring down the armed forces, reduce the armed forces dramatically. Your mind has been one's mind's been totally on building 132,500 aircraft. Well, what do you do now? And what happens to all those factories, and what happens to all those factories that are making tanks and everything else, and what happens to the kind of now that you've had this huge agricultural revolution during the course of the Second World War, what do you do now? Does that all continue, or what? There's actually a huge number of decisions to make about the future, which is just so endlessly fascinating, isn't it?
One of the astonishing things, I think, actually, is how quickly the Attlee government is able to rebuild the export economy. That during the war, one of the big fears is, will Britain ever be able to export enough to make up for all these lost investments? And actually, within the first term of it, they do that because they can still call on a lot of that kind of wartime legacy of people being willing to work hard, to work for a big national cause. So those calls to produce more work, but at the same time,
starts to wear off, though, doesn't it?
Exactly, because what they can't deliver on is the aspiration of the 1930s. So it's that idea that you're working so hard, well, you want things to be a little bit better. You want the hope of actually being able to have a house of your own. All those things.
But that's what the Beveridge report is
doing,
isn't it? That's exactly what the Beveridge report is doing. And I think what's really interesting is when you look at letters and so on from troops in the summer of 1943, for example, a lot of them are talking about the Beveridge report, and they're talking about after the war and what's going to happen, and I think all those things are really fascinating, because people they don't want to kind of have that kind of same experience that happened in 1918 to sort of 1921, where people were coming back and actually the kind of land fit for heroes didn't kind of deliver. So there is this sense, isn't there, that the Britain you come back to needs to be not only different, but it needs to be better. It needs to be more. It needs to be a fairer society, and all those sort of things. And I think a lot of people forget that the 1930s were kind of it was that dark valley, isn't it?
Well, there are two things. In the 1930s, has the dark valley if you're a member of the working classes, so 75% of the population, and you live outside the boom areas of the Midlands and the Southeast, then the 1930s see prolonged unemployment and a lot of suffering, and a big gap in terms of inequality. If you live on the outskirts of London and you're working in light industry, the 1930s is a good time.
Pretty good, yeah.
And I think it's that sense of that being something which everybody ought to be able to have.
Yes,
that's really what that that post-war. The debate about the post-war is how can everybody have that lifestyle?
Yes,
yeah,
yes. But there is a greater expectation of it. Whereas in the 1930s, if you were working class and you were in one of the kind of more impoverished areas, say you were living in sort of, I don't know, Bradford or something, and you were living on a diet of bread and dripping, there was no real hope that you could ever get out of that. But the Second World War changes that. There is this idea that and I know they had kind of officers being appointed in the field and stuff in the First World War, but there's more of that going on in the Second World War. It is still a very classist society, but a lot of those class barriers are being broken down by the Second World War, and there is, because of the Beveridge Report, because of the aspirations of the 1930s and a whole host of factors, there is this expectation post-war, post-1945, that things are going to be better for the masses, not just for the few.
But that also underlines why it's so critical that Labour don't make a mess of their moment at the start of the war.
Sure, and that the Conservatives mess it up.
Yeah.
Because what have the Conservatives been good at since 1918? After Baldwin kind of house trains the Conservative Party, they get very good at stealing more moderate policies, tacking towards the middle, working out where the centre ground is.
And also, the Chamberlain government builds so many council houses, doesn't it? It's part of its stealing Labour's progressive clothes. I mean,
exactly. So I think one of the interesting things about the middle part of the Second World War is that the Conservative failure to adapt.
Yeah. And
it's quite obvious that there are a set of moderate imperialist or Christian conservatives, who are all in some ways willing to buy into that idea of more state action, maybe not as much control over the individual or control over private property as the Labour Party would want, but they're definitely willing to see there's a new political reality. Yeah. And partly because they're so varied in their outlook, they can never agree exactly on what they want, and partly because they get no leadership from Churchill, they never come together to offer a kind of coherent challenge. And it'll take, they don't get their act together after the war either. It takes to the early 50s, really, for them to... Because
I think people, one of the things that is quite interesting is Churchill doesn't become the leader of the Conservative Party until late 1940, until after Chamberlain is deposed as Prime Minister, but remains leader of the Conservative Party, doesn't he? Until he dies, basically. And then Churchill, at the time, says, I don't want the job, I don't want to do it. And is told pretty firmly that he has to, because he didn't want to bother himself with that. He thought, I've got enough on my plate as it is. And that's kind of how he carries on, isn't it?
But also, he's not a
party man.
He's not a party man. Sounds like a good thing these days, right? Yeah. Right? Not a party man sounds like he can't be bothered to get involved in all those partisan fights. He's a very partisan person when it comes to thinking about being opposed to socialism. He's viscerally opposed to socialism. The truth is, he's not very good at parliamentary politics or democracy.
Yeah.
He's not somebody who really gets how you operate in this new post-1918 era of mass democracy. Yeah. He's an electoral liability for the Conservative Party, actually, because he's not somebody who grasps how you tack to the middle. He likes a fight. Yeah. When he tries to do those things in 1945... it's that famous Gestapo speech, which, whether or not it has an effect on how people are going to vote, is a very striking moment in the election. It comes because he's trying to make an appeal to the middle, but it's characteristic of him that when he tries to do it, he gets it wrong.
Yeah.
So, there's another side to that war leader is he just doesn't want to engage with it.
Because the company he kept, he'd choose, wouldn't he? Rather than being a party politician where you think, well, these are the MPs I'm going to have to work with, so I'll need to build alliances and in the traditional party.
No, he just employs who he wants. He just gets in.
He employs who he wants. He gets his friends around him. He has his crew of people whose company he likes. Well, and people who probably shouldn't have anything to do with public life at all, like Max Beaverbrook. So he's sort of rogues gallery people rather than being a classical parliamentary leader. And,
he's a very effective political operator in terms of the interplay of ministerial ambition at the top.
Yeah.
So the way in which he constrains Anthony Eden's ambitions.
Yeah.
So you talked about Stafford Cripps earlier, but actually the big threat to Churchill right the way through is Eden.
Yeah.
Right? Because Eden is the one who can appeal to the middle, who's glamorous,
good looking and dashing.
Likes. Yeah, exactly. So
great war record.
What a great leader for a modern Britain heading forward, rather than this kind of archaic figure of Churchill. But actually what Churchill does right from the start is find all sorts of ways either to stroke Eden's ambition and to say, well, of course you'll be my successor. You don't need to do anything urgent. I'm feeling so ill. Of course, I've said to the king that if anything happens to me on one of these long transatlantic flights, you're the person that must take over, Anthony. All of which is designed to make sure that Eden never makes that jump. And again, they're looking back to
they're looking back because it's possible, because it happens, because Asquith, after all, suffered that exact fate from a younger, snazzier opponent. Now,
Bury just down the road from me, actually. Literally 2 miles from here.
Which one?
Anthony Eden.
Oh, right. While we were off air, we talked about David Edgerton.
Yes. Of whom I have, my admiration is knows
Britain's
no limits.
War Machine.
He's a lovely fellow. He's a brilliant historian. And Britain's War Machine, I think, has been a very, very important book because it has turned on its head a lot of the kind of sort of overall kind of mythology about the Second World War, which has sort of really taken root for the kind of last sort of 50 years, since the 1960s, really. And I think it's absolutely fascinating. And I remember talking to him and having lunch with him and him being very dismissive of that old school kind of narrative history of the Second World War and calling them the declinists. And I said, well, what do you mean by this, David? And he said, well, they all sort of got it in for Britain, saying we're all Britain's rubbish and just hanging off the shirt sleeves of the shirt tails of the Americans and all the rest of it. And at the time, it just chimed so strongly with a lot of research I'd been doing, where I was looking into stuff and I was thinking, well, actually, doesn't seem that bad. Actually, we seem quite good. Gosh, I hadn't appreciated, what a grasp we had of kind of global merchant shipping and all that kind of stuff. And it gets you thinking. And you, my conclusion on this, my kind of sort of view on this is that if you accept that there's 3 levels of war, strategic, tactical, operational, the narrative histories that we've been reading since the 1960s have basically focused almost entirely on the strategic and the tactical and not the operational. When you reinsert the operational level, a kind of rather different picture emerges. But I'm kind of interested, Dan, on your take on all this.
So I share your admiration for David as a historian. I think what I particularly envy about him as a historian is his ability to write concisely and with a very strong argument. He's a natural polemicist in a way, and that means that he can get his point across very clearly. And his later book about the British nation, the making of the British nation, I think also puts those arguments in Britain's War Machine in a bigger context. And I think he manages to place the Second World War in Britain's 20th century history in a really important way. And he's very good on what decline means and doesn't mean. That Britain has astounding, or the British Empire, Britain and its empire have an astounding economic and military power during the conflict. And of course, in 1944, when superpower is coined for the first time, it's used about 3 countries. It's America, it's the USSR, and it's Britain and its empire. It's seen as a superpower, quite rightly so. And yet, Britain's ability to operate independently, its power to determine the world, has declined significantly as a result of the war. And that's what does Churchill, the great imperialist, see during his premiership, but this colossal decline of imperial power after 1942. So I think David's also very good on what happens afterwards?
Yes.
That actually there is this post-1945 nationalist moment when Britain takes on a great national project. So it moves from its focus being imperial to one being national, about rebuilding the economy, reorienting the economy, being able to exist under its own resources, make its own way in the world, recasting itself as more of a welfare state as well. And what he says is, it doesn't work. Britain can't operate by itself anymore. Actually, it takes it a long time to realise this. But in fact, once you have a modern globalised world, and you lose power within that, well, you can't operate by yourself. Yeah. And possibly there are lessons about that for the present and the future. But
But I think one of the things that's really interesting is that this declinist take, this declinist narrative that David terms it. I mean, what do we mean by that? What I mean by that is this kind of view that, broadly speaking, Britain's a bit rubbish, The Americans aren't very good, but they're rich. It's the Russians that have done all the hard yards. The Germans are militarily completely brilliant at everything they do, but they're kind of, the man at top is kind of ideologically very dodgy and sort of ruins it for everyone. And it just doesn't take in account this kind of operational level. And I think a lot of the reason why people think about this is for a number of reasons, but I think one of it is because at the time this change happens is this is Corelli Barnett, it's AJP Taylor, it's who get this whole kind of sort of mode of thinking about Britain's war effort in this, kicking the triumphalist kind of view into touch and kind of looking at a much more declinist view. And that comes at a time where Britain is, the empire is all but over, decline of Britain as a great power. Then you get into the 1970s, you end up with kind of 3-day weeks and, all the rest of it. And you've got the Cold War and the preeminent kind of powers are the Soviet Union and the USA, and it's just little Britain again. And so it's very hard to think of Britain as the Britain of the late 1930s and during the war years of this superpower. And I think that's where a lot of it comes. And I think a lot of this kind of sort of putting the Germans on a pedestal is because after the war, we then they're the only people who fought the Soviet Union. And so we're eager to hear what their views are. And when they do the kind of foreign military studies program for the Americans, but also do their interviews for the British as well, they're tending to put quite a good slant on their own performance. We were just we were soldiers first. We were just trying to kind of, be brilliant soldiers doing our bit for the fatherland and for Germany. We never liked Hitler, blah, blah, blah. And they're putting themselves in a pretty good light, frankly. And all of which is entirely understandable. But it gives you this incredibly kind of warped view, which is that, they've got all this tactical chutzpah and, we're all slow and stodgy and all the rest of it. But those assumptions are based on just looking at it at a very one-dimensional level.
I think that's right, and it's interesting how much of that history is actually telling you more about the period in which it was written than the war itself.
I mean, I do remember saying this to Anthony Beaver once, and Anthony took massive exception because I said, to a certain extent, every historian and every history they write is a product of the age in which they're writing it, rather than the age of that they are writing about. And Anthony took great exception to this, but I stand by that.
It's blindingly obvious, isn't it?
Yeah, well, no, I'm as guilty as that as anybody else.
Well, yes, of course. This is it. The thing. I mean, one of the points, one of the things I think that's interesting because David Edgerton's last book, the
Rise and Fall of the British Nation.
Yeah, the Rise and Fall of the British Nation, the 20th Century Political History. In his introduction, he says, okay, I'm trying to write, I'm paraphrasing, I'm trying to write a book where when we write about Germany, we're allowed to talk about Prussian militarism, right? Because we're not Prussian and we're not German. So we have that distance, we're allowed to do it. He says, maybe it's time to write a book about British, the British politics and the British economy and the British imperial system like that. And because after all, one of the reasons that the British were so able to turn things on apparently on a sixpence in the first 2 years of the Second World War is because this is what this country has been doing for centuries. You look at the Napoleonic War. If you cast the Second World War in that light, it's gearing the economy to a war effort, blockade, coalition warfare on the continent. Fighting your enemy at the end of his supply chains. So, for instance, in Portugal, that it's business as usual. The Second World War on one level. I mean, I'm overstating my case to make my point, but that I think is another way of looking at the Second World War, isn't it? We've done this before.
I'm not sure I'd go back as far as the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, it's come up again and again, hasn't it? The legacy of the First World War. I'm not one of those people who thinks the First World War causes the Second World War, but it does seem to me that there are a set of modes of thought that are preserved from that earlier conflict.
I mean, it's only 20 years difference.
But they're about total war and the need to mobilise whole societies. And the tragedy is that then becomes the logic that drives on the Second World War. Right?
Yeah.
That actually that's the reason that Germany and Italy and Japan want to go to war, because they have to win a quick war to get the resources, because a bigger future war is coming, and if you don't get the resources, then everybody knows from last time around that you're doomed. And the British, you're right, the British are good at that sort of war. It's a state which has developed to be good at that sort of war in all sorts of ways. It's also good at that sort of war because it can impose outcomes on other people, right? Not just its opponents, but also all the people in its empire.
Yeah.
Right. So, when we think about what the British experience of the Second World War is like, we've got to think about all those countries where which are exploited in different ways, in order that Britain can get away with having actually quite an easy go. Easy, relatively speaking, compared to other countries in Europe.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, Dan. Overall, you're saying you don't want to sort of tell people what to think. You want to let them draw their own conclusions from the evidence which you put before them. As you've gone through this epic 2-volume, 20-year project, I mean, how do you view Britain's war effort? I mean, do you overall? I mean, I know that's a very difficult question, but are you admiring, or I mean, do you think actually Britain did bloody well as a, if I was to summarise in one sentence, it did really well, or do you think overall they kind of sort of caught things up a bit?
It's a great history of Scotland by Christopher Harvey called No Gods and Precious Few Heroes,
right,
which actually comes from a line written by, I've forgotten his name now, a Scottish war poet in the Western Desert. And I always think, I mean, if I could put a terminology on all the history I'd like to write, No Gods and Precious Few Heroes, I think is a good aspiration to have. Right? So I don't know if I'm admiring, I think I am in awe of the scale of Britain and the Empire's war effort in the Second World War, and I'm definitely in awe of the long-term planning that conflict involved, and I think it leads to very, I'm not going to say effective military outcomes, it leads to very big military effects. So something like the strategic bombing campaign is achieving minimal effects for a long time for all the investment that's put into it. One of the things that I think is very interesting about that, all that effort and that wasted effort, though, is that bits of it will start to come right in 1944, and they'll still mean that the war ends quicker than it would otherwise have done in Europe.
But also that whole process of, putting so much emphasis on machinery and aircraft and bombers and all the rest of it, because obviously for the number of men you lose in bomber command compared to what you might lose by sort of slogging it in with huge armies. I mean, you've only got to look what happens to the nations that have really big armies. It ends really, really badly, whether you be Japan, whether you be Soviet Union, whether you be Germany. And you put so many boots on the ground, but having huge numbers of boots on the ground is by 1940 standards a very inefficient way of fighting a war, because you end up with more casualties, and that is one of the kind of reasons for becoming so mechanized, putting so much sort of emphasis on steel, not flesh. I mean, that is part of the British war strategy. It's one that's completely adopted by the Americans as well, and you've got to say, by the end of the war, that is, from the point of view of lives saved, British lives saved, that has to be the right approach.
Yes. What I was thinking. So one of the stories that I told at the start of the first volume, and I come back to it at the end of the second one, is about the stories that my family had about the Second World War. And if I look at my grandparents' experience of the conflict, they're bound up with technology. Right? My mum's dad worked for London Transport. He was a bus mechanic, where he ends up being a dispatch rider and then fixing Daimler armoured cars in the Western Desert. And my dad's dad met my grandmother because he was teaching her how to drive. They were both sergeants, him in the army, her in the ATS. So it's again, there's a relationship that only came into being because of technology. So I'm conscious that I'm very lucky in my family experience that I got to meet those grandparent combatants in the Second World War, because they didn't have to do that much combat.
Yep.
You know, my dad's dad fought through a difficult bit of Northwest Europe in 44 and 45 and never forgave the army for not being back in time for the birth of his son. But compared to, you know, if I was German or I was Russian.
Well, one in three people
it's
born between.
It's just a very different experience.
Entire German generations with,
This sort of goes back to my point, is that when you're, and this again goes back to that operational level of how you actually fight wars, how you kind of organise yourself and your resources and your assets to the most pragmatic, practical way of achieving your ends. And when we think about the Second World War, we think about the kinetic bit, the actual tactical bit, the fighting, the cold face of war. You know, we're thinking of people in Sherman tanks and Bren carriers and firing their machine guns and rifles and submachine guns and all the rest of it and hurling grenades. And yet, you know, by 1944, only 14% of the army is infantry, 8% are in tanks, 43% are service corps.
Still pretty bad if you're in the infantry, though. You look at the.
It's really bad. It's terrible.
It's a very short
It's terrible.
straw.
And your chances of coming through unscathed, you know, from 6 months of combat, if you're in the infantry, are statistically zero. I mean, you will get wounded or worse in that period. But the point is that there's another kind of 86% which aren't doing that, and that's fantastic.
Well, it's fortunate, certainly.
Yes,
What do Britons get to spend their war doing? Making stuff and fixing stuff.
Yeah.
Mostly. Yeah. But I you know, the disparity that then results between those at the sharp end who are having the worst experience and everybody else is another thing that I think, you know, in a way that's bound up with how we remember the war, that we can't remember that difference because it's too divisive, you know, and the way that memory works is often that we don't want to talk about those things.
I think that's very true. Very true.
Well, I think we're coming to the end of our time together.
Yeah, well, everyone should read your books, I've got to say.
Absolutely. Everyone should read your books.
Volume 1 is Into Battle, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Volume 2 to come out is A New World, and they're
It's
totally
A New
brilliant.
World. And it's out on the 26th of March.
26th of March.
But you can order now.
You can order it now.
You can.
Are you done with the Second World War now? I mean, you'd be well within your rights to sort of park it and move on to, I don't know, the Korean War. I mean, what?
It would be really nice. For a long while, I thought I'd like to go and write about something nice and joyful and fluffy and not involving mass death. But no, I'm probably going to stick with the Second World War.
Right.
The next thing I'd like to look at is the V-weapon campaign in more depth, and particularly the way that those weapons create emotions.
Yeah.
So they're created as terror weapons,
yes.
But actually the anger, one of the things that's really striking when you look at diary accounts of Britain and British troops and Canadian troops in Europe in the summer of 44 is how furious these weapons made them. So there's something, even in the context of this war in which all these horrible things are being done, there's something about automated weapons targeting the home front that makes British soldiers really cross. And Canadian soldiers, because they all had British girlfriends by that point.
Amazing.
Well, I look forward to reading that. Yeah. Fantastic.
And Dan, also, we're going to see you at the Chalk Valley History Festival.
Yeah, looking forward
where
to it.
you are going to be talking about A New World. But it'd be good to come and have another chat to you then while we're all there as well.
Yeah, I look forward to that.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank
It's been
you.
an absolute pleasure. Cheerio.
Bye-bye.
Cheerio.